Emperor Constantine united a fractured Roman world and convened the Council of Nicaea to forge a single faith that would forever shape the course of history. Welcome, travelers of time and myth, to Forgotten Scrolls. Today, I will accompany you on a story that remains alive in the memory of the centuries. This story is for those who seek to understand the origin of many beliefs that still shape the world today. It is for those who feel spiritual curiosity or simply want a calm guide that explains how a council could change the structure of faith and an entire empire. Here you will discover what the Council of Nicaea really was. You will learn why it gathered, who participated, what decisions they made, and how all of that influences the lives of millions of people to this very day. If you ever wondered where the central doctrines of Christianity came from, this journey will give you clarity and peace. Stay with me, take a deep breath, and join this journey through deep history. Chapter 1. The Empire Needs Unity. At the beginning of the 4th century, the Roman Empire was going through one of its most delicate phases in political and religious matters. After decades of crisis, internal wars, and successive divisions, the ruling power was looking for a new balance that would guarantee stability. The Christian religion, which until recently had been persecuted, was expanding with great strength, but it was doing so in a very diverse way, with communities that interpreted the figure of Christ and the relationship with God in very different ways. That diversity, far from strengthening unity, began to create tensions. These tensions threatened to turn into open conflicts within a society that was already tired of divisions. The growth of these disputes caught the attention of those who managed the provinces. The disagreements among believers were starting to impact daily life and social harmony. In many cities, intense debates arose around the nature of Christ and the authority of the bishops. This resulted in local tensions that were very difficult to control. The situation became especially problematic because faith now played a central role in the social life of thousands of citizens, whereas before it had been on the margins of society. Theological disputes, which often seemed abstract and distant, were now influencing the organization of entire communities. They were creating opposing sides that could not be reconciled. It was natural for Emperor Constantine to observe this situation with deep concern. He understood that no project of stability could succeed if the followers of the same religion were divided to the point of risking peace. His interest in unifying doctrines did not come from absolute religious devotion. It came from a very practical vision of political power. For him, such a vast empire needed a coherent faith that would act as a social glue. He needed a point of convergence capable of strengthening a common identity among the people. If each region kept different interpretations, the unity of the state was in great danger. Besides the political interest, Constantine saw that the Christian expansion offered a unique opportunity. After legalizing the religion with the Edict of Milan, he wanted to consolidate his authority through the support of the bishops. However, these leaders were deeply divided. That fragmentation threatened to turn a potential ally into a source of instability. The emperor understood that, to avoid internal disputes, it was absolutely necessary for the bishops to agree on a doctrinal framework. This framework would limit the most conflicting interpretations and establish a common core of beliefs. The crisis did not revolve only around religious ideas, but also around the figure of Arius. Arius was a priest from Alexandria, whose teachings were influencing very large sectors of the population. His statements about Christ woke up intense passions, strong support, and total rejection. The controversy spread through Egypt, Syria, and other regions. It caused disputes that even required the intervention of local governors. It was clear that the situation had become impossible to sustain. Constantine understood that if he did not act, that division could become a structural problem for the government. The political structure of the empire also explained why this topic gained so much importance. After years of crisis and fragmentation, the emperor had managed to reunify authority, but that cohesion was still very fragile. A society that was reorganizing under a new balance could not afford such deep religious disputes. This was especially true when those disputes affected the legitimacy of local authorities. The bishops, in that context, not only had spiritual influence, but also administrative power. Their disputes had a direct impact on civil life. Constantine initially tried to resolve the situation through letters and distant mediation. He tried to persuade Arius and his opponents to moderate their positions. However, these efforts were not enough. The controversy was too intense, and the arguments were too deeply rooted to be solved in an informal way. The division had already gone beyond theology and began to take on political characteristics. This made more forceful action urgently needed. The emperor then decided to call a great meeting that would gather the most influential leaders of Christianity. He hoped that a common space would allow them to establish final agreements. This decision not only sought to resolve a specific controversy, it aimed to lay the foundations of a mechanism that would strengthen the role of the Church as a unified institution within the state. It was a strategic bet. Unify the faith to unify the empire. Establish a doctrine to stabilize a still recent government. Alongside his concern for internal order, there was also the ambition to secure his legacy. An emperor capable of bringing peace to the emerging religion and guiding it toward a solid structure would guarantee stability during his reign. It would also ensure a favorable memory in history. Thus, intervening in the doctrinal issue was not just an administrative need. It was an act of political vision that sought to go beyond the present moment. The idea of a general council, although not completely new, now took on a size never seen before. Never before had representatives from all regions been called to address a doctrinal problem of such magnitude with the direct support of imperial power. This meeting aimed to become a milestone that would define the course of Christianity in its stage of accelerated growth. For this reason, the preparation of the council was carefully organized from the imperial court. The tensions were not limited to the regions where the controversy began. In other parts of the empire, positions began to arise that looked with suspicion at the influence of Arius or his opponents. Some communities lived their faith in a simpler way and sought to protect themselves from other people's disputes. Others gathered behind charismatic leaders who took a firm stance. The diversity was such that, without a unifying intervention, the fragmentation threatened to expand. As the division intensified, the reports reaching the emperor showed that the authority of the bishops was weakening in several regions due to doctrinal discussions. This was deeply concerning, as these leaders were essential to the religious administrative structure that was forming. If they lost credibility, the effort to integrate the church into the imperial project would also be affected. Faced with this scenario, the calling of the council became the only solution capable of offering a clear and binding answer for everyone. Constantine, aware of the size of the challenge, decided to act firmly. He called the meeting that would take place in the city of Nicaea in the year 325. That act would mark the beginning of one of the most decisive moments in the history of Christianity. It was a moment in which politics and faith would converge to define the course of a world in transformation. Chapter 2. The Road to Nicaea. In the years prior to the meeting, tensions grew constantly within the Christian communities of the East. The teachings of Arius, spread with skill and conviction, had caused intense debates in Alexandria and other important cities. His statements about the relationship between the Son and God created a true intellectual earthquake. This shifted the theological discussion from study circles to squares, homes, and temples. The size of the dispute became clear when even people without deep education began to repeat complex arguments. This showed that the issue had penetrated deeply into all levels of believing society. Bishop Alexander of Alexandria reacted firmly to what he considered a dangerous doctrinal deviation. He called local meetings, wrote letters, and called on his fellow bishops to warn about the seriousness of the Arian teaching. This conflict was not just between two figures, but between different ways of understanding the Christian faith. Every letter Alexander sent found an echo in various regions. There, other bishops evaluated the situation and began to form opinions that would later influence the council that was to come. The disputes intensified so much that they began to generate a chain of local synods. In some, the teachings of Arius were condemned, while in others, the freedom to interpret them was defended. This series of contradictory decisions increased general confusion. It made clear that there was no universal mechanism capable of resolving a doctrinal conflict definitively. With each region taking different positions, Division seemed inevitable, and communication between communities became increasingly tense. In parallel, the exchange of letters between bishops became a network of debate that covered vast distances. Each document carried analysis, warnings, and sometimes severe scoldings. Some writings were copied and circulated among the faithful. This allowed ideas to travel faster than the leaders could control them. This constant flow of arguments became a prelude to what would later be the official discussion in Nicaea. It showed that the problem had already grown too big to be solved without major intervention. The pressure increased when provincial governors began sending reports to the Roman court. They pointed out that doctrinal disputes were causing public disorder. Although these were not armed conflicts, the social tension was noticeable and affected even daily activities. Some communities split into two sides that no longer shared the same worship or the same understanding of the Christian message. The fragmentation was not just theological, but also community-based, and that worried those who oversaw public order. Constantine, who had already tried to mediate by sending peacemaking letters, received news showing that the dispute went beyond simple differences of opinion. The root of the division was deep and required more than just well-intentioned advice. It was in that context that he began to consider the idea of gathering a universal council, an assembly that would cross regional borders and give a unified answer to the crisis. This step implied an unprecedented degree of imperial intervention in the life of the Church. Meanwhile, bishops from various regions also began to realize that local synods were not enough. Some leaders with influence, like Hosius of Cordova, advised the emperor to call a broader meeting. Hosius, who had already acted as a mediator in other religious disputes, played an important role in the organization of the future council. His travels and previous correspondence helped establish the first bridges for the different factions to accept the idea of a common meeting. The months leading up to the official announcement were marked by intense preparations. Each bishop had to consider what position he would bring to the meeting and how he would support it before colleagues coming from distant territories. Some dedicated themselves to reviewing ancient theological traditions. Others collected testimonies from recent synods that supported their positions. The expectation grew rapidly, as a council of such size had never been held. Many guessed that its decisions would have long-lasting effects. As news of the future meeting spread, the faithful also became emotionally involved. For many, this council represented the hope of a definitive solution that would return harmony to divided communities. Others feared that an official decision could strengthen one group at the expense of another, creating new tensions. The uncertainty fueled conversations in markets, homes, and temples. It made the journey to Nicaea a present topic in the daily lives of thousands of believers. The route to the host city was not just a physical journey, but also a process of collective maturity. The participants knew that this was not a simple academic exchange. It was a historical moment in which it would be decided how faith would be understood from then on. Many bishops began the journey with groups that included deacons, scribes, and assistants. This showed the seriousness with which each region prepared for the meeting. The choice of Nicaea as the headquarters responded to both political and practical reasons. The city, close to the imperial residence of Nicomedia, offered security and easy access. Furthermore, its location allowed representatives from east and west to travel with relative comfort. It was a strategic point where the emperor could closely supervise the progress of the council. He could ensure that the discussions were kept within an orderly and respectful framework. Finally, with the official announcement made, preparations concluded, and the massive movement of Christian leaders toward Nicaea began in the spring of the year 325. That march gathered bishops from diverse traditions and regions. It symbolized the collective desire to find a solution that would benefit the entire church. The road to Nicaea was essentially the journey that transformed a theological crisis into a universal call for unity. It prepared the ground for one of the most significant meetings in religious history. Chapter 3. The participants of the Great Meeting. When the bishops began arriving in Nicaea in the spring of the year 325, the city experienced a transformation that reflected the size of the event. For the first time, Christian leaders from very different regions met in the same space. They brought with them diverse traditions, languages, and experiences. Many had traveled for weeks by land and sea routes. Their presence revealed the breadth that the faith had reached within the empire. Nicaea became a point of convergence where religious history was preparing to make a decisive leap. Among those present were figures who had suffered persecutions decades earlier. This added an aura of respect to their participation. Some showed scars from ancient tortures, a living testimony to a time when professing faith could cost one's freedom. Their presence was a reminder that the church had gone through an extraordinary transition. It had gone from secrecy to taking a central place in the decisions of the state. These veteran bishops were listened to with special attention. They embodied the memory of a Christianity that had persevered in the midst of hardship. Within the assembly, Hosius of Cordova also stood out. He was a man close to the emperor, whose influence would be decisive during the council. With a career marked by interventions in previous disputes, Hosius enjoyed imperial trust. He possessed extensive experience in mediating between bishops. Many saw him as a bridge between East and West, capable of smoothing tensions and easing agreements. His presence symbolized the intention to give the meeting a truly universal character. Another important group was made up of bishops coming from the eastern regions, where the controversy had reached its highest intensity. Among them was Eusebius of Caesarea, known for his learning and for his closeness to the imperial court. His knowledge of Christian history and of the relationship between church and state made him a relevant voice in the debates. His presence also demonstrated that the intellectual sphere would have a prominent role in the discussions that were about to start. The leaders who supported the teachings of Arius also sent representatives, although their influence varied depending on the region of origin. Some came with the intention of defending deep convictions. Others sought to avoid a condemnation that could isolate them within their communities. The presence of these bishops showed that the council was not a uniform meeting. It was a gathering where different positions coexisted, each convinced of safeguarding the most faithful interpretation of the faith. Not all the attendees were widely known figures. Many bishops came from small and distant regions where Christianity had grown steadily, although without major disputes. These leaders brought a perspective less marked by theological conflicts and more focused on the practical life of their communities. Their participation balanced the presence of the most combative voices and showed the variety of experiences within the church. The atmosphere in Nicaea mixed expectation and seriousness. The bishops met in homes, courtyards, and public buildings to exchange opinions before the formal start of the sessions. In those early meetings, some sought to form alliances, while others tried to better understand the opposing positions. These early conversations helped clarify the central points that required attention and helped define the dynamics of the council. Along with the bishops, traveled deacons and assistants who fulfilled essential roles. They did everything from drafting documents to providing support during the long sessions. Among them stood out Athanasius, a young deacon from Alexandria who did not yet hold a leadership position. But his energy and firmness would later make him one of the most influential figures in defending the doctrine formulated in Nicaea. His early participation showed that the council not only gathered established authorities, but also emerging key players who would mark the future. The cultural diversity was obvious. Some bishops spoke Greek, others Latin, and others used local languages that were difficult to translate. This linguistic mosaic required interpreters and created communication challenges. But it also illustrated the breadth of Christianity. Despite language differences, the participants shared the conviction that they were facing a crucial moment in the history of faith. They were willing to dedicate time and effort to seeking agreements. The presence of the emperor added a significant political element. Although he would not participate directly in the doctrinal discussions, his authority weighed heavily on the atmosphere of the council. The bishops knew that their decisions would have state support. They knew the meeting was not just an academic debate, but an event with administrative consequences. This created a delicate balance. The church sought to preserve its independence, but it could not ignore the imperial support that had allowed the meeting to happen. The meeting place, chosen by the emperor, offered comfort and security. The building destined to host the sessions reflected the importance of the meeting. with wide spaces that allowed attendees to gather in order. The arrangement of the seats, the tables for the scribes, and the presence of imperial guards showed that considerable effort had been dedicated to ensuring that discussions took place in a suitable environment. As the last participants arrived in the city, expectations reached their highest point. NICEA had become a space where the past, present, and future of Christianity came together. The attendees knew that the decisions they were about to make would not only affect their immediate communities, but entire generations. The diversity of those present, their personal histories, and the tensions that accompanied them set the stage for a council that would transform the understanding of faith throughout the Mediterranean world. Chapter 4. The Debate on the Nature of Christ. When the formal sessions of the council began, it became clear that the central point to be resolved was the understanding of the nature of Christ. The controversy had grown so much in previous years that local statements or private discussions were no longer enough. Now, in front of an assembly that represented the entire Christian world, the positions had to be presented clearly, and each argument would be subjected to rigorous examination. The initial atmosphere was serious, filled with the feeling that the decisions made there would mark the spiritual course of the empire for generations. The position defended by Arius held that the Son had been created by God, and therefore was not eternal or equal to the Father. According to this perspective, Christ had a highly elevated rank, but he did not share the divine essence. This idea sought to protect the absolute uniqueness of the Father. But to many, it seemed that it dangerously lowered the figure of Christ and put the very understanding of salvation at risk. The representatives of this position argued that their vision responded to the biblical tradition and to a sincere desire to preserve divine greatness. In contrast, other bishops firmly defended that the Son was consubstantial with the Father. That is to say, that he shared the same divine essence and existed from eternity alongside him. For these leaders, denying this equality meant destroying the Christian faith as it had been transmitted in many communities. They argued that if Christ was not truly divine, his work could not offer full salvation. This position did not arise as an emotional reaction, but as a deep theological reflection that sought to maintain continuity with the received tradition. The tensions between the two positions were obvious, even before the speeches began. Although the discussion took place in theological terms, the emotional weight was notable. For many bishops, the figure of Christ was not a mere doctrinal concept, but the foundation of their spiritual life. Therefore, any statement that altered their understanding of the relationship between God and the Son caused great worry. In that heavy atmosphere, every word spoken had the potential to significantly influence the mood of those present. When the arguments began to be presented, the depth of the debate surprised even those who knew the controversy well. Biblical passages, writings of ancient teachers, and worship traditions were analyzed. Some speakers spoke with a calm and thoughtful tone, while others did so with a passion that showed the personal importance they attached to the topic. Each intervention revealed different aspects of the Christian tradition and expanded the collective understanding of the problem. One of the most tense moments arose when some expressions attributed to Arius, which described the Son as a creature, were read aloud. Many bishops reacted with outrage. They considered that such expressions could not be accepted in Christian teaching. For them, the divinity of Christ was a non-negotiable foundation, and the mere idea of lowering his rank was offensive. These reactions did not seek to censor the opponent, but to show the seriousness with which they understood the doctrinal consequences. As the days passed, the discussion began to focus on finding a term capable of expressing precisely the relationship between the Father and the Son. It was then that the Greek word that would become the star of the council emerged, homoousios, which means of the same essence. This term was not common in the Christian tradition, but it seemed to offer a formulation that solved the problem. Its introduction generated intense debates, as some feared it could be interpreted incorrectly or associated with philosophical ideas totally foreign to the faith. Despite initial doubts, the concept began to gain acceptance as a useful tool to safeguard the full divinity of the Son. The defenders of this formulation argued that without it, there was a risk of maintaining a dangerous vagueness. They needed a clear expression that left no room for interpretations they considered problematic. This search for doctrinal precision reflected the council's commitment to clarity and unity. During the sessions, some bishops tried to mediate between the parties, proposing alternative formulas that would allow some kind of peace. However, these proposals were often insufficient to resolve the conflict. Some expressions were too vague, and others too close to the positions they sought to avoid. The complexity of the theological problem demanded a firm and well-founded solution that could stand up to the examination of future generations. The presence of the emperor in some sessions added a symbolic dimension to the debate, even though he did not intervene in the doctrinal discussion. His stance, oriented towards unity, made it clear that the resolution had to be clear and final. He did not force a position, but his interest in the stability of the empire motivated the bishops to seek an agreement that would avoid future divisions. This indirect influence helped speed up the decision-making process. With each passing day, the positions became more defined. Many bishops who initially sought a middle solution began to lean towards the formula that affirmed the full divinity of the Son. The clarity offered by the term homoousios allowed a growing number of participants to consider that the controversy could not be resolved without a strong statement. The idea that Christ shared the same essence as the Father began to consolidate as the most coherent option within the doctrinal framework. Finally, the debate reached a point where the arguments had been exposed in all their depth. The parties had defended their positions, alternatives had been evaluated, and the theological scope of each word had been discussed. The assembly understood that it was time to make a collective decision that would define the official teaching of the Church. From this process, the Council moved toward the formulation of a declaration that would preserve doctrinal unity and respond to the crisis that had motivated its gathering. Chapter 5. The Decisions and the Canons. After weeks of intense debate, the time came when the Assembly had to transform the discussions into formal decisions. The Council did not meet solely to resolve the doctrinal controversy over the nature of Christ. It also gathered to establish rules that would reinforce the cohesion of the Church. The bishops understood that unity could not depend solely on theological statements, but also on practical rules that guaranteed order and harmony in church life. This combination of doctrine and discipline became one of the pillars of the Council. The first great resolution of the meeting was the drafting of a document that clearly expressed the official teaching about the Son. This declaration sought to put an end to the vagueness that had allowed the expansion of the controversy. The bishops carefully drafted each sentence, aware that a single word could generate new disputes. Although the discussions had been deep, the final decision had to be understandable to all communities. This included those far from urban centers where theology was discussed with greater rigor. In addition to the doctrinal declaration, the Council created a series of canons that regulated fundamental aspects of church life. These rules covered everything from the organization of the clergy to the behavior of those who aspired to positions of authority. Although some canons responded to recently emerged problems, others sought to standardize practices that until then varied between regions. The intention was that, just as in doctrinal matters, the discipline of the Church would also be consolidated under a common framework. One of the most significant canons dealt with the reconciliation of Christians who had fallen away during previous persecutions. This topic was particularly delicate, as many believers had given in out of fear or pressure and now sought to reintegrate into the community. The Council decided to establish clear rules for their readmission, avoiding both excessive harshness and disorganized leniency. The measure sought to heal old wounds and promote unity after decades of suffering. Another issue addressed was the relationship between bishops from different regions. The Council reaffirmed the importance of respecting traditional jurisdictions, especially around cities with historical authority, such as Alexandria, Antioch, and Rome. Although these seats did not receive an identical formal status to what they would acquire centuries later, the Council practically recognized their relevance and the need to maintain a balance between them. This decision helped prevent local disputes from spreading unnecessarily. The Council also dealt with disciplinary problems within the clergy. Some canons regulated issues such as mandatory celibacy for certain positions, the moral behavior of priests, and the prohibition of practices that could put the reputation of the Church at risk. These rules did not arise from general accusations, but from specific situations that had become common in some regions. By establishing precise rules, the bishops sought to reinforce the integrity and credibility of those who performed sacred functions. Among the practical decisions, there was one particularly relevant to the life of worship: the setting of a common date for the celebration of Easter. Until that moment, different communities followed different calendars, which could cause confusion and even tensions between neighboring cities. The council considered it fundamental to establish a unified date that would strengthen the shared Christian identity. This resolution, although technical, had a profound impact on religious life and symbolized the desire for unity in fundamental aspects. The council also discussed matters related to the ordination of bishops. Procedures were established that had to be followed to avoid impulsive appointments or those motivated by local rivalries. The canons sought to guarantee that those who took on these responsibilities did so after a balanced process and with the support of their colleagues. This measure helped consolidate a more solid episcopal structure that was less vulnerable to internal conflicts. A topic that generated special attention was the situation of the bishops who had supported the ideas of Arius. The council decided to offer opportunities for reconciliation, provided they expressed their agreement to the new doctrinal declaration. However, not all accepted this condition, and some were removed from their positions. This resolution showed that unity could not be based on the coexistence of opposing doctrines, but on a clear commitment to the collectively defined teaching. The presence of the emperor at the final approval of the canons showed the close relationship that had been established between the church and the state. Although the content of the decisions belonged to the bishops, imperial support gave these rules an administrative dimension that made them binding throughout the territory. This collaboration did not eliminate religious autonomy, but it made it clear that the church was entering a new stage of institutional influence. Each approved canon reflected the conviction that the stability of the church depended on both doctrinal clarity and disciplinary consistency. The bishops understood that a balance was necessary between tradition and adaptation, between authority and mercy. Although some details might vary over time, the set of rules approved in NICEA laid the foundation for a more structured organization that was less vulnerable to internal divisions. When the bishops concluded the review and approval of the canons, they knew they had established a lasting framework. These decisions did not intend to solve all the problems of the future, but they did provide a firm structure capable of resisting new tensions. The council, by combining doctrinal decisions with practical measures, managed to consolidate church life in a decisive period. Thus, the decisions and canons of NICEA became a reference that would deeply influence the later evolution of the Church. Chapter 6. The Nicene Creed is born. Once the most urgent issues of the Council were resolved, the time came to formulate a common declaration of faith that clearly expressed the position held by the majority of the bishops. It was not simply a matter of writing an administrative document. It was about establishing a doctrinal symbol capable of guiding Christian communities and putting an end to the interpretations that had given rise to the controversy. The creation of the Creed would therefore be the heart of the Council and the most visible expression of its unifying purpose. The drafting began with intense discussions on how to formulate each phrase. The bishops wanted to avoid ambiguous terms that allowed for contradictory readings, but they also had to ensure they did not introduce concepts completely foreign to the Christian tradition. This balance was delicate because the desire for precision could lead to overly philosophical expressions, while a lack of clarity could give rise to new disputes. The task required caution and a deep understanding of the scriptures and of the teaching passed down through generations. A central element of the document was the affirmation that the Son was begotten, not made, and that he shared the same essence as the Father. This expression responded directly to the controversy that had motivated the Council and left no room for the idea that Christ could be a creature. The phrase was chosen after evaluating various alternatives, looking for a formulation that was clear and at the same time faithful to what the bishops considered the most authentic tradition. In this way, the doctrinal declaration gained a solidity that would allow it to be sustained through the centuries. The inclusion of the term homoousios, which affirmed the essential unity between the Father and the Son, was one of the most decisive moments of the process. Although some bishops feared the word could be interpreted improperly, Most recognized its usefulness to exclude interpretations incompatible with the faith they sought to preserve. The acceptance of this term marked a turning point because it allowed the full divinity of Christ to be expressed with a precision that no other word had managed to offer. In addition to the relationship between the Father and the Son, the Creed included statements about the Incarnation, the Passion, the Resurrection, and the future coming of Christ. These statements were not part of the main debate, but they were necessary to offer a complete vision of the faith. Their presence helped connect the new doctrinal formulation with the traditional teaching that believers had received since the earliest times. Thus, the Creed was not presented as an innovation, but as an enriched reaffirmation of the fundamental truths of Christianity. Another important aspect of the document was the explicit condemnation of the teachings that the Council considered incompatible with the faith. It was not just about affirming a doctrine, but also rejecting the interpretations that had caused confusion. This rejection did not have a political character, but a theological one, and sought to preserve the internal consistency of the Creed. Although the condemnation generated tensions, it was seen as a necessary measure to prevent vagueness from weakening the newly achieved unity. During the drafting process, some bishops expressed concerns about the authority of the document. They feared that by presenting such a precise formulation, theological freedom would be limited or a too rigid framework would be imposed. These objections were heard with respect, and the role that the Creed should play in the life of the Church was discussed extensively. Finally, a consensus was reached. The Creed would be an essential doctrinal guide, but it would not replace the richness of tradition or the continuous reflection of believers. When the drafting was complete, the text was presented to the Assembly for approval. The reading was done with solemnity, and many bishops listened to each phrase with emotion, aware that they were participating in a historical moment. The majority supported the document, although some withdrew or refused to sign it. This disagreement reflected the depth of the conflict, but it did not overshadow the collective decision that had been reached. The signing of the Creed by the bishops present symbolized their commitment to doctrinal unity. More than an administrative act, it was a gesture of spiritual responsibility that sought to guide Christian communities in a time of uncertainty. The signers understood that the document had to be transmitted faithfully so that each region could advance with a common understanding of the faith. This commitment reinforced the sense of cohesion that the Council had sought from the beginning. After its approval, the Creed began to circulate among the different Christian communities. In many regions it was received with relief, as it offered a clear guide in the midst of confusing debates. In others, it generated controversies, especially in places where previous teachings had had a strong influence. However, even in these cases, the document helped to center the discussion and to open spaces for teaching and reflection. The Creed became a fundamental tool for unity and religious instruction. The importance of the Creed did not lie solely in its doctrinal content. It also lay in the fact that it had been approved by a universal council. This legitimacy gave the document an authority that went beyond local disputes. Over time, the Creed would be adopted in worship and in Christian formation. It became one of the most influential texts in the history of the Church. Its origin in the Council of Nicaea would forever mark its character as a doctrinal foundation. With the creation of the Creed, the Council achieved one of its main goals. The Christian faith was expressed clearly, and doctrinal unity was strengthened against interpretations that had generated division. Although the document would not resolve all future tensions, it provided a solid basis for the life of the Church. It allowed advancement toward a deeper understanding of the tradition. Thus, the Nicene Creed was born, a declaration destined to last throughout the centuries. Chapter 7. Immediate Consequences and Conflicts. When the Council concluded, the feeling among many bishops was of relief and hope, since the decisions adopted seemed to offer a clear path to doctrinal peace. However, upon returning to their regions, they soon discovered that the implementation of these resolutions would not be easy. The Christian communities experienced the diversity typical of a vast territory, and not all were willing to accept without resistance the conclusions reached in Nicaea. What in the Council had been a majority consensus, in many cities became a reason for debate and tension. In some regions, the leaders who had supported the rejected ideas found themselves in a difficult position. The council's decisions required them to align with the new doctrinal formulation, but many of their followers maintained a deep conviction around previous teachings. This tension generated friction between bishops and the faithful, and in certain cases gave rise to groups that sought to preserve the interpretations that the council had dismissed. Thus, the desired unity was threatened by resistance that reflected the complexity of the Christian world of the 4th century. Among the characters who were directly affected by these resolutions, one of the most influential was Arius himself. Although he had not been present at the final drafting of the Creed, his name was associated with the controversy that the council tried to resolve. After Nicaea, the church authorities expected him to correct his teaching and submit to the new doctrinal formulation. However, his willingness to do so was unclear, which generated suspicions among those who feared that the controversy had not been fully resolved. The position of Arius was not the only problem. Some bishops who had initially accepted the Creed began to show doubts upon returning to their headquarters. In environments less burdened by the tension of the council, they began to reflect more freely and to consider whether they had acted under pressure. These hesitations reinforced the idea that doctrinal unity had to be consolidated with long pastoral work, and not only through official declarations. The fragility of some agreements showed that the struggle for stability was still far from over. The emperor, who had supported the council as an instrument of cohesion, found himself once again facing a challenging situation. Although his intention had been to promote unity, the diversity of reactions showed that the reality of the empire was more complex than expected. Some figures close to power, influenced by different theological groups, tried to persuade the emperor to reconsider certain decisions. This created a climate in which politics and theology once again intertwined significantly. One of the most delicate points arose when some bishops who had signed the Creed were removed by their communities, who rejected the council's conclusions. These removals showed that the authority of the bishop was not enough to guarantee the acceptance of the Creed. In certain places, the faithful preferred to keep local tradition rather than follow a decision emanating from a distant assembly. This resistance raised questions about the relationship between central authority and the independence of communities. Meanwhile, movements developed that sought to reinterpret the Nicene Creed to make it more compatible with previous positions. Some theologians tried to soften the force of the term homoousios, proposing explanations that reduced its definitive character. Although these interpretations did not cancel out the content of the Creed, they did open the door to new discussions that threatened doctrinal stability. These reinterpretations showed that, even after its approval, the document remained a battlefield of opinions. Tensions also manifested themselves in the political sphere. Certain imperial leaders saw the conflict as an opportunity to reinforce their influence over the bishops. The doctrinal vagueness that persisted in some sectors allowed certain figures to present proposals that sought to please different groups. These maneuvers were not always motivated by theological convictions, but by power interests seeking an advantage in a still unstable scenario. The figure of Athanasius, who had participated in the council as a deacon, emerged in this period as a firm defender of the Creed. Upon becoming Bishop of Alexandria, he faced considerable opposition from those who continued to sympathize with the rejected ideas. His leadership provoked theological and political clashes that deeply marked Christian life in Egypt. Athanasius became a symbol of the struggle to maintain the integrity of the council's decisions, although his stance also led him to exile on several occasions. The conflicts after Nicaea did not only affect the large cities. In rural regions and small communities, where the presence of bishops was less frequent, the reception of the Creed depended on the level of education of local leaders. In some cases, the lack of clarity made it easier for incompatible doctrines to persist. This demonstrated that doctrinal unity demanded a continuous effort of teaching and could not be guaranteed merely by decrees. Over time, doctrinal clashes extended beyond the original question. New interpretations arose that questioned aspects related to the understanding of the Son and his relationship with the Father. These differences showed that the controversy had not been eradicated, but transformed. The council had laid a firm foundation, But the process of doctrinal consolidation would require decades of effort, debates, and additional clarifications. Despite the conflicts, the decisions of Nicaea had introduced a new way of understanding church authority. The fact that a council could establish universal norms reinforced the idea of a church united around collective decisions. Although implementation was difficult, the structure created in Nicaea served as a model for future meetings that would be fundamental to Christian history. In this way, the immediate consequences of the council, even while generating tensions, contributed to forging a more solid identity, conscious of its mission. Chapter 8: The Expansion of Orthodoxy. As the years passed after the council, the doctrinal formulation approved in Nicaea began to spread throughout the empire. However, this process was far from uniform. The teaching defined by the bishops had to reach very diverse communities. Some were deeply trained in theological tradition, and others were located in regions where Christian instruction was still limited. This challenge demanded a continuous effort from bishops, teachers, and preachers. They took on the task of explaining the creed clearly and accessible, thus consolidating the foundations of the emerging orthodoxy. In several important cities, the creed was quickly integrated into worship life and instruction. Local leaders understood that its acceptance could not rely solely on the authority of the council, but also on a deep understanding by the faithful. Oral teaching played an essential role, as it allowed people without written education to understand the meaning of the new doctrinal statements. The transmission of the creed became an act that was both intellectual and pastoral, aimed at unifying the identity of the communities. As the creed spread, theological schools emerged that adopted it as a main reference. These institutions, located in centers like Alexandria, Caesarea, and Antioch, began to develop commentaries and reflections that delved into its content. Although each school had its own style and method, they all agreed on maintaining the central teaching defined in Nicaea. In this way, orthodoxy acquired a solid intellectual base that allowed it to face later debates with greater clarity. The expansion of the creed also transformed preaching. Sermons in churches began to include explanations about the relationship between the Father and the Son, the eternity of Christ, and his role in salvation. These teachings, which in the past might have seemed too abstract, now became essential elements for spiritual formation. Preaching helped strengthen doctrinal unity, allowing people of different cultures to receive the same basic teaching about the Christian faith. In some regions, however, the expansion of orthodoxy met resistance. Interpretations that had been strong before the council continued to attract large groups, especially in areas where influential leaders still defended previous ideas. This resistance forced the bishops to combine firmness with patience. Debates moved to new settings, where the defenders of the creed sought to persuade their opponents through argument and testimony. Doctrinal unity was not imposed solely with authority, but with the personal conviction of those who spread it. One of the most interesting aspects of this stage was the role played by monks. As monasticism expanded in regions like Egypt, Syria, and Palestine, many of these men and women adopted the creed as part of their spiritual commitment. Although they did not participate directly in theological debates, their life dedicated to prayer and reflection gave moral strength to the Nicene teaching. For many faithful, the example of the monks helped associate orthodoxy with a life of authenticity and virtue. On a political level, the creed approved in Nicaea began to influence administrative decisions. Some later emperors used the Nicene teaching as a criterion for appointing or removing bishops. This reflected the growing relationship between politics and religion. This interaction was not always harmonious, but it showed that orthodoxy had become a central element in the structure of the empire. Faith was no longer just a spiritual matter, but a fundamental component in the cohesion of the state. In the West, the spread of the creed was relatively more stable, as Christian communities showed fewer divisions than in the East. Western bishops adopted it quickly, and in many cases their teachings were integrated without major resistance into worship and instruction. This stability allowed Nicene orthodoxy to consolidate in territories that would later play a crucial role in the evolution of Christianity, especially during the fall of the Roman Empire in the West. In the East, on the contrary, the situation was more dynamic. Doctrinal disputes persisted for decades, fluctuating between positions that sought to soften the content of the creed and those that defended it firmly. This scenario generated a rich intellectual exchange, but also tensions that affected political and religious life. The expansion of orthodoxy in the East was, therefore, a gradual process, full of debates that eventually helped clarify Christian teaching even further. Throughout this period, the Nicene Creed began to acquire a symbolic dimension. It was not simply a doctrinal text, but a sign of belonging for those who followed the Council's teaching. Affirming the Creed became an act that expressed continuity with apostolic tradition and unity with the universal Church. This symbolic character was fundamental to strengthening Christian identity in a time of constant changes and challenges. Over time, the Creed was enriched with new formulations that responded to debates arising after Nicaea. These additions, made in later councils, did not contradict the original teaching, but developed it to face new questions. The Nicene Creed thus became the foundation upon which the famous Niceno-Constantinopolitan Creed would be built, which is still recited today in many Christian liturgies. Its expansion and evolution showed the vitality of a teaching capable of talking with history. The consolidation of orthodoxy after Nicaea was not a straight-line process, but it was effective. Over decades, the teaching defined in the Council became a reference for doctrinal unity and spiritual formation throughout the empire. The expansion of orthodoxy not only unified theological understanding, but also strengthened the sense of belonging to a community that extended beyond political and cultural borders. Thus, the seed planted in Nicaea grew into a tradition that would last through the centuries. Chapter 9. Curiosities and Lasting Legacy. With the passing of centuries, the Council of Nicaea acquired an almost mythical dimension within Christian history, but its legacy rests on concrete facts that deeply transformed the religious and political life of the ancient world. One of the most striking aspects is that, although today it is remembered as a decisive council, many of its participants never imagined that their decisions would have such wide repercussions. They acted within their own time, solving urgent problems, without foreseeing that they had shaped a document that would mark entire generations of faithful. An interesting fact is that the exact number of bishops present has been a matter of debate among historians. Some sources speak of around 250, while others mention more than 300. The number of 318 became traditional in Christian memory, probably because it had a symbolic value and because some ancient authors adopted it to highlight the importance of the meeting. Beyond the numbers, the truth is that the geographical and cultural diversity of the attendees was one of the elements that enriched the deliberation process. Another curiosity related to Nicaea is that it was not the first attempt to gather bishops to deal with doctrinal matters. Throughout the 3rd century, regional meetings had already been held in different parts of the empire, but none with the size and universal authority of the council called by Constantine. In this way, Nicaea became the prototype of ecumenical councils, which would later be decisive in resolving other theological controversies. Its structure would serve as a reference for centuries. A less-known aspect is how the emperor influenced the atmosphere of the council without imposing doctrinal conclusions. His participation was not that of a theologian, but that of a ruler who wanted to unite his empire under the same religious framework. Although his presence was symbolically powerful, the bishops kept the responsibility of formulating the doctrinal definitions. This combination of political authority and religious deliberation marked a complex model of relationship between church and state that would have profound consequences in later history. The physical place where the council was held also has historical interest. Nicaea, located near Lake Ascanius, was a strategic but relatively quiet city, which made it easier for participants to concentrate. Its closeness to the imperial residence allowed accessibility and security, crucial factors for a meeting of such magnitude. Although many buildings from that time have disappeared, the memory of the council turned the city into an iconic place for Christian tradition. One of the most widespread curiosities is the existence of legendary tales about supposed physical fights among the participants. Some later texts hint that a bishop would have slapped another during the discussions, but there is no solid evidence to support these claims. Rather, these stories reflect the emotional intensity that surrounded the controversy and the later desire to dramatize the events. What is documented indicates that, although there were real tensions, the atmosphere remained within the proper limits of theological debate. Another significant point of the legacy of Nicaea is that the initially approved creed did not include the section dedicated to the Holy Spirit as it is known today. That part would be developed later, especially at the Council of Constantinople in the year 381. This shows that Christian theological reflection continued to evolve, and that Nicaea was a starting point, not an end point. Its impact lies in having established a firm basis upon which later formulations would be built. The figure of Athanasius, who had played a secondary role during the council, became one of the most influential voices in preserving and defending the Nicene teaching. Throughout his life, he faced exiles and persecutions for his doctrinal firmness, but his dedication was key to the consolidation of orthodoxy. His tireless defense helped keep the spirit of Nicaea alive at times when theological tensions threatened to once again shatter the achieved unity. Christian worship also reflects the lasting impact of Nicaea. In many traditions, the creed became a central part of the Eucharistic celebration, recited by entire communities as a sign of unity. This liturgical use helped integrate the council's teaching into everyday spiritual life. It reinforced in the faithful the awareness of belonging to a tradition that went back to the founding meeting of Nicaea. Thus, the doctrine ceased to be just an intellectual concept and became a shared expression of faith. The council also had a profound effect on the way the church was organized. The idea that universal decisions could be made by a body of bishops gathered in an assembly opened the way for future ecumenical councils. This institutional model made it possible to address complex disputes through collective dialogue and shared reflection. It prevented Christianity from breaking into incompatible identities. The conciliar structure thus transformed into an essential tool for the preservation of unity. Over time, the historical importance of Nicaea went beyond even the limits of Christianity. Philosophers, historians, and thinkers from different eras studied its decisions to understand how ideas are institutionalized. They looked at how human communities seek doctrinal stability. The council became a classic example of the moment when theological reflection, community identity, and political power come together to define the direction of a civilization. Its legacy continues to be the subject of deep studies and modern debates. Thus, the Council of Nicaea endures as one of the most influential chapters in religious history. Its capacity to formulate a common doctrine, establish disciplinary rules, and create a precedent for future collective decisions made it a pillar of Christianity. Although tensions continued after its celebration, its footprint remains in the spiritual, institutional, and cultural life of millions of people around the world. Nicaea was not an isolated event, but the beginning of a path that shaped faith and consolidated a tradition that has withstood the test of time. If you want to continue exploring historical events like this one, I invite you to subscribe to the channel. Please drop a like on the video and leave a comment down below to share your thoughts with our community of knowledge seekers.